We are back again with On The Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm your host Newsome, and we are here once again in Vegas for UFC Vegas 35. This event is headlined by a very violent fight between two dangerous strikers with monstrous kicks as Edson Barboza fights Giga Chikadze. There's a possibility here of a 25-minute war with both fighters smashing kicks at each other. This is one of my favourite fights of the entire year so far. I cannot wait. We also have the Ultimate Fighter 29 finale fights in both the middleweight and the bantamweight division, which I'm also really looking forward to. It's a shame that one of the actual finalists got injured during his fight camp as Trajan Gore had to pull out, and it was Gore that was my heavy prediction to win that middleweight finale too. This tough season has been phenomenal, by the way. I've really enjoyed it. If you haven't watched it yet, it's all on Fight Pass. Go and binge it. It's been a great season. But just before we get into those breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMA Play 365. We took a slight loss with the official bets last weekend, but it could have been very different as Luis Saldana injured his foot after smashing Lingo in round one. The injury caused Saldana to start tiring and the volume dropped as well, but even on one foot, he was about a minute away from winning the fight until he got dropped with a body shot at the end of round 3. The other loss was Clay Guida, who lost a super close split decision to Marco Madsen. Guida was also the money back guarantee dog of the week as well. The winning bet we did have was Ramiz Brahimaj, who completely ran through Sasha Palatnikov and submitted him early in round 1, so as a minus 125 bet, that was easy money. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMA Play 365 website for all the UFC betting advice and DraftKings and FanDuel advice that you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAplay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event. In the violent main event, we've got Edson Barboza versus Giga Chikadze. Barboza is currently the slight minus 117 favourite, with the comeback on Chikadze the slight minus 103 underdog. It's also a minus 110 pick'em and very close at other books as well. As for where the value is on the betting line, like I've just said, the lines are really close across the market. It's one of those fights where I think if you've got a good read on either side, then either side is definitely playable. Like I said, as long as you've got that good read. And as for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, it's fluctuated a lot here. Barboza was a plus money underdog just a few days ago. A lot of money's been coming in on Barboza, it seems. It's pushed Barboza into a pick'em and then now into that slight favourite position. I do think that we're going to see some money coming back on Chikadze at some point though. I don't think Barboza's going to fly off into a minus 125, minus 130 favourite, or if he does, it probably won't last very long before that plus money of Giga is hit and the line comes back to where it is now. Ultimately, when both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I wouldn't be shocked to see Barboza a very slight favourite, like I say, minus 115, minus 120, but it also wouldn't shock me to see a pick'em, and actually it wouldn't shock me to see Giga Chikadze a slight favourite either. But it's going to be in and around that range. I don't think any fighter's going to ping off. I do think it's going to be roughly where it's sitting right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, as I've mentioned already, it's going to be violent. I think it's quite obvious that this fight is going to be won and lost on the feet. At the end of the day, though, it is a mixed martial arts fight, so if we were to see some wrestling and grappling, you can't be totally surprised, but the better work in this fight, the bigger action moments in this fight is going to be on the feet, and like I say, that's where it's going to be won and lost. So you're just analysing two strikers here now. Both strikers are very kick-based strikers. So Giga Chikadze used to fight for Glory Kickboxing background. Obviously, Barboza's got a kickboxing Muay Thai background. We know all about Barboza for all the years that he's been in the UFC. He's been regarded, especially from my perspective, as probably the most dangerous kicker in the UFC throughout his tenure. So it does make this fight very interesting, and I believe it comes down to whichever fighter starts breaking their opponent inside the cage on the night. Now, with Giga Chikadze, I do think that he's the more educated striker in regards to just being a little bit more patient on the feet, especially whilst he's trying to make reads. And once he gets his reads and starts spotting holes and gaps in his opponent's defense, he'll then attack those spots, whereas Barboza will just start smashing kicks at all levels. He's really quick firing his kicks out as well, but he'll kick to the head, he'll kick to the body, he'll fire to the legs. But where I said that Giga Chikadze is the more educated striker, I think Barboza's actually the more dangerous striker because of this. Like I said, he won't necessarily look for holes and gaps and make his reads. He'll just throw and he'll just land them, because everything that he throws lands so powerful with his kicks. He doesn't necessarily need to start finding that gap on the body where he'll just fire it and make sure that it hits the ribs or hits the midsection. If it hits the arm of his opponents, it's going to hurt the opponent's arm. It's going to start bringing the guard down. Then he can go to the head. So he's got more volume with the heavy kicks because he just doesn't wait around. He just goes straight in there and you'll just start smashing at the different levels, at the legs, at the body and the head. And that's another thing from Giga Chikadze's perspective as well. Giga tends to be more of a kick to the body. He calls it the Giga kick. And of course he'll kick to the legs, of course he'll kick to the head, but it's the body kick that he really likes. It seems to be his signature move. It's almost like a grappler that's just knocked a few fighters out, 2 fights in a row, and then they start to fall in love with that knockout. Giga's a little bit the same, I feel, with this body kick. He loves the body kick and he'll routinely go to that, whereas Barboza will mix his levels up. So that's one advantage I give Barboza in the kicking department. But the problem is, if Giga does land on the body of Barboza, that's actually probably the one place that Barboza is going to be really vulnerable in this fight. I think if you kick Barboza to the legs, of course it's going to hurt him. I don't think it's going to have too much of an effect. I don't think that Giga's going to be able to just catch Barboza to the head really easily either. So the likelihood of that happening is relatively low. I just see this body kick as being the most dangerous weapon for Chikadze, and if he does go on to win this fight, it wouldn't shock me if he landed one of those body kicks, hurt Barboza to the body, and then just finished him from there. Now, I've spoken about the kicks of both fighters, obviously, because they're both insane kickboxers, but with this fight being won and lost on the feet, the other thing you've got to analyse here is the hands and the boxing of both fighters, and this is where I was quite surprised in tape when I was looking for this, because actually Edson Barboza is a better boxer than what I gave him credit for, and I think what the public give him credit for as well. His hands are actually really good, and against Burgos, he was landing some nice punches. Against Amir Khani, who was landing some nice punches. Against Hooker, he was landing some nice punches. Barboza really does have some decent hands, but it doesn't really play a focal part when you're watching him fight, because it's the hard, powerful kicks that everyone gets excited by. But actually, when you strip it back inside the pocket, Barboza's not only got decent power on his hands, but he's got good combinations and he's comfortable inside of that boxing range as well. And this is where I think it gives him the edge in this fight, because although Giga Chikadze can box also, Chikadze's boxing doesn't seem as technical. His punches seem to be a bit loaded up. He wings them, puts a lot of power behind them rather than just using fundamentals, throwing a jab out there and setting up combinations. Chikadze's more of a, if I'm going to punch you, I'm going to try and take your head off type of striker, and it's his kicks that's the technical part of his game. So when you're looking at the different ranges of this fight, the kicking range is obviously going to be really interesting. I do give Barboza a very slight advantage there, just because of the volume and the fact that he doesn't wait around, and like I've already said, he'll just smash instantly to the legs, body and head. But then naturally, when the ranges close up a little bit and they get inside of boxing range, it's absolutely Barboza that I favour in there. I just feel that he's going to be more comfortable. I do think that Chikadze is going to pack more power and aggression into this fight, and that's something that Barboza's got to be aware of, because if we're talking of durability, I think at this stage in both the fighters' careers, Giga Chikadze is probably the more durable fighter. So in a firefight, in a fist fight where they're both landing 100% punches, I do favour Giga Chikadze. But in regards to technique and education of the boxing, I do think that Barboza has just got better hands. And like I said, he went out there and knocked Burgos out in a very weird way, albeit, but he shut Burgos' body down, and even Josh Emmett struggled to do that. Josh Emmett knocked him out a couple of times, and I believe Emmett's one of the hardest hitters in the division, but he couldn't knock Burgos out in the way that Barboza knocked him out. So Barboza's got power, he's got hands. I do favour him in the boxing. I give him the very slight edge in the kicking as well, and it's for those reasons I'm picking Edson Barboza to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the Ultimate Fighter 29 middleweight final between Bryan Battle versus Gilbert Urbina. Battle is currently the minus 155 favourite. The comeback on Urbina at plus 135 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line is actually where I expected it to be. I didn't expect Bryan Battle to be a minus 200 favourite. I still think he's got room for development, which I'll talk about shortly, but I did expect him to be around this sort of minus 150, maybe minus 145 favourite. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, Bryan Battle actually opened up or was sitting at minus 175 just a couple of days ago, so So the money's come back in on Urbina again, which I expected it to, if I'm being honest. I think minus 175 was slightly too wide. But I do think there's going to be a little bit of fluctuation, but nothing major. I don't think the line's going to ping off in one particular way. I don't think we're going to see Bryan battle back at minus 175. But in the same respect, I don't think we're going to see him at minus 130, minus 135 either. So when both fighters step into the cage, I expect the betting line to be sitting roughly where it's at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's a really interesting fight because you look at Gilbert Urbina's last fight against Trajan Gore, who I think is an absolute beast. Urbina hung in there and he wasn't scared to trade in the pocket with Trajan Gore. And even when Gore started dropping Urbina, and you could see that every time Gore landed on Urbina, it was hurting him and sitting him down, it didn't prevent Urbina from still wanting to come forward and get into that boxing range and strike. Both fighters are really well-rounded here. They can both strike, they can both wrestle offensively and defensively, and they can both grapple as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see which fighter really starts to pull away inside the cage. But with Bryan Battle, the one thing that I really like about him is he was one of the last pick fighters in the house. But halfway through the show, Alexander Volkanovski, his coach, he was telling Dana White, look, Bryan Battle is improving rapidly. Watch out for him. He's going to be the one to beat. And that's exactly what happened. Now, if there was betting lines for that semi-final fight between Battle and Andrei Petroski, who's also on this card, by the way, Petroski would have been a massive favourite in that fight. But Bryan Battle started to get the upper hand in the striking. He stuffed the takedowns, managed to keep the fight standing, and then he eventually submitted Petroski as well. So for me, Bryan Battle is improving rapidly, and I do think when it comes to this fight, again, I think it's a fight that we might see more of a mixed martial arts fight here. We might see some wrestling, we might see some grappling, but ultimately I do think that the better work in this fight is going to be done on the feet. And although Gilbert Urbina's Torfi will continue to come forward, he's going to make this fight competitive first and foremost. Absolutely he will, but I think it's going to come down to which fighter is the better mover, which fighter's putting out more volume, and ultimately who's just more efficient on the feet. And I think that's going to be Bryan Battle in this fight. I think he's just slightly quicker than Urbina. Like I say, Urbina's going to have no problems getting in his face, trying to land with him. If he was doing it with Gore, he's definitely going to do it with Battle. But I just think that Battle is very savvy on the feet. He's got good fight IQ. He won't allow himself to get backed up to the cage. He won't allow himself to be backed up in straight lines. He'll find exits. He'll find angles. He'll get back into space. And I think he's just going to put a volume-based performance on Urbina. And really, I just think it's going to be that simple, if I'm being honest, because Battle's obviously faced a better wrestler in Petroski in the house. He dealt with him. And although I'm sure Urbina, can knock an opponent out, this is MMA, 4-ounce gloves, I just don't think he's got that one-shot knockout power that's going to be enough to worry Battle to become hesitant or even just get caught and get knocked out. So I do think that Battle's got all areas covered here. I do think that he's going to pump out more volume. I think he's going to be more active, and I think he's just going to look slightly better on the night. Like I said, it is going to be competitive. Urbina is a good fighter, but ultimately I just think Battle might be a difficult puzzle for Urbina to solve, and it's for those reasons I'm picking Bryan Battle to win this fight and become the Ultimate Fighter 29 middleweight winner. And in the next fight, sticking with the finale, we've got the Ultimate Fighter 29 bantamweight final between Ricky Turcios and Brady Hiestand. Turcios is currently the minus 160 favourite. They come back on Hiestand at plus 140 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the favourite in Ricky Turcios. I actually thought Turcios would be a minus 200 favourite. I think anything north of that would have been too much, but I think minus 200 would have been a fair line. So being at minus 160, I do think that there's some value on Turcios there. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think the bigger movement's been made so far, because a few days ago when this line opened, Turcios did open at minus 180, got bet to minus 185, and honestly I do think that that's the biggest movement we're going to see here. I don't think the line's going to ping off in any particular direction right now. I think that when both fighters step in the cage on Saturday night, the betting lines are going to be roughly where it's sitting now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, the first thing I do want to talk about is Brady Hiestand, because I do get the sense that Hiestand is going to be a developing fighter over the next few years. He's very young, he's training with Michael Chiesa. He's got a very similar style to Chiesa as well, especially with the heavy grappling. He's got decent wrestling as well, so I got a funny feeling that Hiestand, like I've said, is going to develop quite rapidly over the next few fights. But but I think in this particular fight with Turcios, I'm not sure it's going to be there enough to go out there and beat someone like Turcios, who is a really interesting fight to analyse. He's so well-rounded. His base is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so he does have good submissions off his back. He's got good top control as well. He's good in the scrambles. He's good from transitioning from position to position. But he's also, I wouldn't say he's a technically good striker, but he's a very creative striker. I don't even think he knows what he's going to throw until he starts throwing it. He's very aggressive on the feet. He's very herky-jerky, if you like. He'll come forwards. He'll throw some very strange strikes from very strange angles. And if he doesn't really know what he's going to throw, it's going to be really difficult for his opponents to make reads. And Turcios constantly talks about being unpredictable, and I think that's the right word to use here. And this is why I think Hiestand's going to have a tough time with Turcios, because on the feet, Turcios pushes a pace, he's aggressive, he's got good cardio, he's got good volume, he'll throw with power as well. And like I say, that good cardio helps with the fact that he doesn't tire out too much with that power that he's throwing in every strike. So on the feet, I think Hiestand's just going to have a difficult time trying to strike with him, and I don't think he's going to get the upper hand in the striking either because of that. So Hiestand naturally is going to look to wrestle, because on the mat is where he's going to want the fight. But even if he does take Turcios down, which he probably will do, although it's not going to be easy, I don't think he's going to be able to have his way with Turcios on the mat like he did with a couple of other fighters in the Ultimate Fighter house. I think Turcios is just very skilled on the mat and skilled enough to prevent Hiestand just taking him down and riding on top and getting in good positions and looking for submissions. Turcios is going to be really active off his back. He's going to be striking off his back. He's going to be looking for submissions. He's going to be looking to try and create a scramble and get back on top of Hiestand. And I just think, like I say, he's going to be a tricky problem to solve for Hiestand, and I'm just not sure Hiestand's going to be able to solve it on the night. I think Turcios is going to prove to be the better striker, the more efficient striker, and I think he's going to be able to match Hiestand in the wrestling and grappling. And if it's Turcios that gets on top of Hiestand, starts tiring him out, then the longer the fight goes on, the more it favours Turcios as well. So I just think it's a bad stylistic fight for Hiestand, and it's for those reasons I'm picking Ricky Turcios to win this fight and become the Ultimate Fighter 29 Bantamweight winner. And in the next fight, we've got a really interesting one here. We've got Kevin Lee versus Daniel Rodriguez. Lee is currently the minus 155 favourite. The comeback on Rodriguez at plus 135 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with Kevin Lee at minus 155. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think it's going to fluctuate. I think a lot of people might actually be on Rodriguez here, like the fact that he's got good striking and got good power, which I'll talk about shortly. So I've got a funny feeling we are going to see some Daniel Rodriguez bets, and I think the line's going to close up a little bit. I can obviously see the other angle of people betting Kevin Lee, but I just got a funny feeling that we are going to see some Rodriguez tickets. It's going to close it up a bit. I don't think it's going to be anything drastic. If Kevin Lee goes into this fight a minus 140, minus 145 favourite, I'm not going to be too surprised. Now, as for how this fight plays out, again, like I said, it's going to be a really interesting fight. You've got Kevin Lee, who's, in my opinion, taken a big step down in competition compared to some of the beasts that he's been fighting. And then on the flip side with Rodriguez, this is a huge step up in competition compared to his previous opponents as well. I mean, he's fought some decent fighters, but Kevin Lee's been in there with some of the best fighters on the planet, so it's absolutely a step up in competition for Rodriguez. And normally in these types of fights, I'll sit here and I'll say, yeah, it's a massive step up and there's levels in this game, and that's true, but I'd also be saying the fighter that's taken the step down is the better striker, is the better wrestler, is the better grappler, but that's actually not the case here. Daniel Rodriguez, in my opinion, is probably going to be the better or more efficient striker. He's going to have more power, in my opinion. I think he's more fundamentally sound. Now, Kevin Lee can match him on the feet, but I think if you are giving slight edges, I would give a slight edge in the striking of Rodriguez, just purely because of those fundamentals, the educated jab, the straight left, obviously out of the southpaw stance. And then when Rodriguez starts putting combinations together, he will really start putting the combinations together, putting power behind them. There's technique behind it. Whereas Kevin Lee won't really put combinations together. He can strike. He does have a nice jab. He's got nice kicks as well, kicking to the legs, kicking to the body, and especially to the head. And he's got a good step-in switch kick as well. So Kevin Lee, what I do like about his striking is that he's got variety. So he won't be a beast striker striker, but he will be able to hang with the best strikers in the division, and he's definitely going to be able to hang with Rodriguez. I don't think Rodriguez is anywhere close to being one of the best strikers in the division, but I just think in regards to efficiency, Rodriguez, with the power that he's got and the combinations that he's got and the fundamentals that he uses with the striking, is probably going to cause Kevin Lee a few problems. But Kevin Lee's striking isn't where he shines in the cage. He shines with his wrestling. He's a very good wrestler. And actually, if Rodriguez does prove to have an edge in the striking, it's only going to force the wrestling out of Kevin Lee, which I think he's not going to need any invitation to start shooting takedowns anyway. But this is where the biggest gap in skill is in this fight for me. I think it's the wrestling. Rodriguez hasn't really fought any wrestling heavy fighters in the UFC, but he has been taken down a couple of times. Now, Rodriguez, I think, has got decent takedown defense. He's got strong hips. He's got a thick frame. But at the same time, he can be taken down. Mike Perry took him down twice. The first time Perry took him down, he managed to get a decent amount of top control as well, which was very interesting to see. But the thing is, even if Rodriguez stops the first takedown from Lee, Lee will drive through, put Rodriguez's back against the cage, and he'll start chain wrestling. And this is where he's eventually going to get Rodriguez down to the mat. Even if he, like I say, he doesn't get him down on the first attempt, Lee will continue. He'll be relentless. He will start taking down Rodriguez. Kevin Lee has taken down every single fighter he's ever fought in the UFC, apart from 2. Bear in mind, he's had 17 UFC fights, and one of those 2 he didn't take down was a first round brutal knockout of Gregor Gillespie. And once the takedowns start happening in this fight, you might see Rodriguez become a little hesitant with his striking, just because he just doesn't want to get taken down again. That'll start making life easier for Kevin Lee from a defensive striking perspective. He can start being more offensive with his striking. He can then start being more offensive with his wrestling, closing the distance, and it just makes the fight easier as it goes on. But that's if Rodriguez becomes hesitant. We don't know if that's 100% going to be the case. It's just, it happens a lot with relentless wrestlers. But when this fight goes to the mat, Kevin Lee's grappling, his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in my opinion, is very underrated. He's got more submission wins in his career than he does have decisions or knockout wins. He's submitted fighters like Michael Chiesa, Francisco Trinaldo, Magomed Mustafayev, so he's got good submissions. Like I said, it's a really underrated aspect of his game. And when I saw Mike Perry on top of Rodriguez, and Rodriguez did get a little bit stuck at the end of that first round, I just imagine if that's Kevin Lee on top of Rodriguez, not only is Kevin Lee going to have that wrestling heavy top pressure, but he's also got good grappling, good positional awareness, good submissions. I think he's going to be a nightmare on top of Rodriguez. So ultimately with this fight, I think Rodriguez has got to be careful. I do think that he could start landing some power shots on the feet. Does he knock Kevin Lee out? It's a possibility. He does have that power, and once he starts loading up, Kevin Lee has absolutely got to be careful in this fight. There's a reason that Kevin Lee isn't a minus 200, minus 250 favourite. But like I said, I think the biggest gap in skill is with the wrestling. Once the wrestling starts flowing, the grappling will kick in. I think that's where Kevin Lee's got another advantage as well. And I think this fight is going to be won and lost with what happens in that wrestling and grappling department. I think Rodriguez will do some good work on the feet, but I think it's going to be outweighed by Kevin Lee's wrestling and grappling. And for those reasons, I'm picking Kevin Lee to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got 2 fighters from the Ultimate Fighter 29 house. We've got Andrei Petroski versus Michael Gillmore. Petroski is currently the minus 550 favourite. The comeback on Gillmore at plus 425 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, the line's very close for Petroski at minus 550, where it's going to be a little bit too wide in MMA in general to play, but I actually really understand the line. I understand why it's this wide. I also think if you want to play Petroski in a parlay, it's probably not a bad option. If you wanted to play Petroski to finish, it's probably not a bad option. Petroski is just going to be dominant in this fight, in my opinion. So for minus 550, I completely understand it. And weirdly, I think the minus 550 is the better bet than the plus 425 of Gillmore. As for where this line moves throughout fight week, really interesting that Petroski opened up at minus 175. I'm not sure if the guy that opened that line's still going to have a job after that, but I do think it was a crazy line. It got steamed instantly. I think the line's only going to grow throughout fight week as well, and if Petroski gets into the cage at minus 700, I wouldn't be surprised. As for how this fight plays out, Like I said, I just think it's going to be a dominant performance from Petroski, if I'm being honest. But I just want to quickly talk about Gilmore. So Gilmore didn't initially get into the Ultimate Fighter house. What happened was I think he got rejected, but he ended up having to quit his job to stay in Vegas if he wanted to stay in Vegas in case there was a short notice opportunity. And that's actually what happened. It was actually Gilbert Urbina that was supposed to fight some other dude, but he hurt his knee, so Gilmore stepped in on short notice. Dana White loved the dude. Now, Gilmore's style is definitely more of a technical brawler, if you like. And actually, when he came into the house on this short notice, he needed a crash course, if you like, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with Rener Gracie before that fight, just because he said that he doesn't really grapple a lot, he doesn't roll a lot, and he just needed that crash course, that quick one day of this is how you grapple. And I know that sounds weird and I might be over exaggerating it a bit. You know, I'm sure that Gilmore knew certain positions and certain submissions, but at this level, fighting guys in the Ultimate Fighter house, it just wasn't there. And this is a massive concern in this fight against Petroski, because Petroski is a very solid wrestler and he's also a really good grappler. That's his style, wrestling and grappling. He can strike, but he just prefers not to. And when he does strike, it's not really fundamental technical striking. It's more of, I'm just trying to hit you with something hard. But again, using his strikes, just like a lot of wrestlers, to close that distance and get the wrestling going. And when I talk about gaps in skill, this is a huge gap in skill with the wrestling and grappling. I don't think Gilmore's going to be able to defend the takedowns, or if he defends the first one, I don't think he's going to defend the second. And if he does, eventually Petroski's going to get him down. And when Petroski gets him down, Petroski's solid with his positional ability. He's heavy on top. He can transition from position to position. He'll find a way to the back. I just don't think Gilmore can stop it whatsoever. I don't think Gilmore's going to be able to have done enough Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training between when they were in the house to where they are now to actually stop Petroski's dominance in this fight. Now, the only saving grace that I'll give Gilmore is if he can catch Petroski early, hurt him, or maybe just kick him to the calf and potentially damage that lead leg so he's struggling to wrestle. The one area, the one red flag that Petroski's got now on his name is that fight with Bryan Battle where he just tired out. You know, Battle was defending the takedowns and Petroski's gas tank just zapped instantly. So it's going to be really interesting to see the next time we see Petroski go 15 minutes, 3 rounds, or even get into the second round just to see how he looks. But I don't think that's going to be the case in this fight. I do think Petroski's going to go to his wrestling early. I think he's going to be able to take Gilmore down. Once he's down, I think he's going to be able to get Gilmore out of there, whether that be by a submission or flattening him out, taking the back and finishing him with strikes. I just think Petroski's got a very clear path to victory in an area where he's so much better. So it's for those reasons I'm picking Andrei Petroski to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Gerald Meerschaert versus Makhmud Muradov. Muradov is currently the minus 600 favourite. The comeback on Meerschaert at plus 450 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I'm personally shocked that Muradov is up at minus 600. Sure, he should be favoured to win, but minus 600, I honestly didn't see that coming. I do think that if you are going to bet the money line in this fight, I absolutely think that Meerschaert at plus 450 is the better bet than the minus 600 of Muradov. As for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, all that money's been coming in on Muradov. He's moved from a minus 350 favourite where he opened to minus 600. I do think that it's going to continue to grow. He's even minus 700 in another book. So I do think the money's going to come in on Muradov. I think he's going to be a part of a lot of parlays. He's just that type of fighter with that type of line this week. I think that he is going to be in a lot of parlays. And as I always say, the parlay money does widen the betting line. I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of people rush into the betting window to bet the plus 450 of Meerschaert. So again, I do think that there's going to be a slight increase on the line of Muradov. I think it's going to widen a little bit further. And I do think it is going to close around the minus 650, minus 700 betting line. Now, as for how this fight plays out, like I keep saying, the betting line's just nuts in my opinion. Muradov opened at minus 350, which I thought was about right, and that's probably where it should be. But I do think this is a massive overreaction to Muradov being a much shorter favourite in his last fight against Andrew Sanchez. I actually bet Muradov at minus 133, I think it was, but he went in the cage and he did look like a minus 250, minus 300 favourite, and I do think we've got an overreaction. But when you actually look at the opponents, Sanchez and Meerschaert, I think they're both in the same category, so the fact that Muradov's up at minus 600 here, like I said, it's nuts. And if Meerschaert does go into this fight and he submits Muradov, how that happens, is irrelevant. If the result of this fight is Gerald Meerschaert wins via submission, who's actually going to be surprised? Because I'm not, and I think anybody that watches a lot of MMA and analyses fights, I don't think they'd be massively shocked at that either. But it's just everything outside of that. When you look at the fighters, Muradov is a solid fighter. He's a good striker, good fundamentals. He's got power. He doesn't load up on strikes. He will build into a fight and eventually look to find power with volume, which is really key, and it's an educated striker. He's got decent wrestling. He can be taken down if he's got a good wrestler in front of him and if they're relentless, but in the grand scheme of things, he's got decent wrestling. He can get back up to his feet if he's taken down. He won't overly search for takedowns himself. He's got them if he needs them, but especially in this fight, I don't think it's going to be much of a factor. And I think from taking the betting lines out of everything, I think when you're really breaking this fight down, I think the fight's going to probably be won and lost on the feet. I do think Meerschaert's going to try and mix in wrestling. He's going to try and take Muradov down. He might even get him down once or twice, but I don't think that the fight is going to be won and lost in the wrestling and grappling departments. I don't think the bigger moments are going to be in that wrestling and grappling. I think the best moments of this fight is going to play out on the feet. I think the majority of the fight plays out on the feet, and I think Muradov is just the more technically sound striker. He's quicker, he's got more power. I think his movement's better than Meerschaert's as well. Meerschaert, I do think he is going to get pieced up in this fight whilst it's on the feet. I think Muradov's going to have a good time striking against Meerschaert. So taking the betting lines out of it, I do think that Muradov has got a lot of advantages in this fight. And like I said, I did agree with the minus 350 betting line. I just don't agree with how much it's being steamed. Regardless, I'm picking Makhmud Muradov to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Abdul Razak Alhassan versus Alessio Chirico. Chirico is currently the minus 240 favourite. The comeback on Alhassan at plus 200 is the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think the value sits with the underdog in Alhassan at plus 200. I think the betting line's too wide. It should be much shorter. I'm not even convinced that Chirico should be a favourite in this fight. If it was a pick, I might have understood. So I do think the value sits with Alhassan at plus 200. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, people seem to be loving Chirico. I think he's going to be in people's parlays as well. I think he is going to be the more bet fighter, whether it be straight or in parlays, than Alhassan. So I think the line actually widens up a little bit, but I think here it can only go so far. If Alhassan starts hitting plus 225, plus 230, I just think we're going to see a surge of bets coming in on him just because the value is going to be there. And as for how this fight plays out, actually how this fight got put together is really interesting. Chirico supposed to have fought Kisriev. Alhassan supposed to have fought Braga Neto. Braga Neto pulled out. Kisriev pulled out. So now the UFC have matched these two together. Now what's interesting is Kisriev was going to wrestle heavily against Chirico. I think that was quite obvious. And Braga Neto was also going to try and get the fight down to the mat with Alhassan on his back. Braga Neto was head and shoulders levels above better than Alhassan with his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and probably would have submitted or got Alhassan out if the wrestling had been successful. So both fighters were going to actually be dealing with wrestling, takedowns and grappling, but now they've both got a striker in front of them. Now granted, Chirico is the more well-rounded fighter. He is the fighter that's more likely going to look for the wrestling, but that's not a focal part of Chirico's game. He can wrestle, he can grapple, but it's the striking where Chirico does his best work. And if I'm honest, I'm not massively high on Chirico. Like, I think he's okay, and I think he's a good fighter when he's fighting guys like Zach Cummins and fighters in that mid tier of the division. I think Chirico's a good fighter. Now, I'm not saying Alhassan is in the upper tier of the division, but I'm just not sold on Chirico being a minus 240 favourite in this spot. I think the majority of the fight is going to play out on the feet, unless Chirico is really smart. He looked at what Malkoun did to Alhassan in Alhassan's last fight and takes Alhassan down. That would be super smart, and if that's his game plan, I completely understand the minus 240 betting line. I'm just not convinced that is going to be his game plan because his wrestling isn't a focal part of his game. So I think that the fighters in this fight are going to stand and strike. I think they're going to trade. I think Chirico's the more technical striker. I think he's more fundamentally sound. But Alhassan packs power, and I know he hasn't knocked anybody out in a while and he's on a 3-fight losing streak, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have power himself. And Chirico can be got at. Chirico can be forced on the back foot, and Alhassan is a forward pressure striker. And I do think if this fight goes late, I'm not solely convinced that Chirico just takes over because Alhassan gasses out. If this fight is played out on the feet and Alhassan's landed some nice punches, Chirico's cardio and gas tank is going to start being affected because of the strikes that he's absorbing as well. I think both fighters will be tired going down the stretch if this is a striking war. But I do think that Alhassan's power is going to come through in this fight. I think he is going to snap that 3-fight skid. Like I said, if Chirico comes into this fight and just shoots a double leg straight off the bat, doesn't even think about striking with Alhassan, then he's going to win the fight eventually, because if he doesn't submit Alhassan or finish him on the mat, if this fight makes its way back up to his feet, or if the round ends and they start the next round and Chirico is just going to shoot again and rinse and repeat, just like Makhmud did, I do think that Alhassan would be made to work, and I do think that Chirico would win that fight in that situation. Like I say, it's just not a focal part of Chirico's game with the wrestling. I think the majority of this fight does take place on the feet. Chirico will have his moments, but I think the power of Alhassan will come through. Whether he just hurts Chirico for 3 rounds, maybe he starts slow, drops the first round and picks up in rounds 2 or 3, or maybe he just comes out all guns blazing and looks to knock Chirico out in the first round early on. I am picking Abdul, Razak, Alhassan to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Sam Alvey versus Wellington Turman. Turman is currently the -130 favourite. The comeback on Alvey at +110 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the slight favourite in Wellington Turman at -130, simply because I just expected Turman to be a slightly bigger favourite. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I did say I expected Turman to be a slightly bigger favourite. He was a slightly bigger favourite a couple of days ago. All the money's come in on Sam Alvey over the last 48 hours. It's closed the line up a little bit. I do think we're going to see some fluctuation like this. It seemed that the -150 line of Turman was like at a brick wall, and when it hit there, money started coming in on Alvey. So I think that's the trend that we're going to see. And ultimately, when both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I do think the betting line's going to be sitting roughly where we're at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, Sam Alvey, I love Sam Alvey, I really do, but his style just doesn't change at all, and it actually makes him quite easy to analyse. But what it also makes it easy for is his opponents to game plan for him. The blueprint on how to beat Sam Alvey is absolutely out there. It's just whether his opponents want to read that blueprint and execute a game plan to beat him relatively comfortably. But with Alvey's style, his back is always up against the cage. He doesn't have too much movement. He just backs up in that straight line and fights with his back on the cage, and it's actually the worst, or one of the worst places to be in inside a cage. But the one saving grace for Alvey is the fact that throughout his career, and he is getting old, he is aging, but throughout his career he's always been a counter striker. So the fact that he's usually always in that really bad position of his back against the cage, he can actually make it work for himself because he's used to counter striking and just firing as his opponents are coming in. But still, it's not a clever game plan. I don't think it's something that's going to allow him to beat fighters at this level in the UFC, and I don't think that there's a coincidence he hasn't won in his last 6 fights. He did have the draw against Darren, a split decision, and he did have a split decision loss against Ryan Spann where you could have argued that Sam Alvey won the fight. But it's not a coincidence with the way Sam Alvey fights, with the fact that he doesn't change the way he fights, he doesn't alter and come in with a different game plan depending on what opponent is fighting. It's no coincidence he hasn't won in 6 fights. So I do think that from Wellington Turman's perspective, the fight's there to be won should he not get cracked by Alvey, because Alvey's still got power. He's got a lot of knockouts on his record, even though he hasn't knocked anybody out for quite a while. So Turman definitely has to be careful, especially because he's been knocked out now in his last 2 fights in the UFC. But the 3 things that Turman really struggles against in his fights experiences high-paced fights, aggressive fighters, and he also struggles when he can be put on his back. Although he's a good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, he's definitely a top game player. So when he's put on his back, he can have problems. He can get a little bit stuck underneath. And like I said, in firefights, fast-paced fights with aggressive fighters, again, he can struggle. But those traits, those bad traits of Turman, are the complete opposite style of fighter that he's facing in Sam Alvey. Sam Alvey isn't going to present those problems to Turman. So on the feet, I think Turman's going to get Alvey's back against the cage. I think he can dictate the pace of the fight, the range of the fight. Turman's got some nice front kicks that he can use without putting himself into that boxing range, which is going to be the dangerous range for him in this fight. Because like I said, Alvey can crack. Turman's been knocked out in his last 2 fights. So you've got that narrative there. Now with Turman, if he does want to go all the way in, close the distance and try and get this fight to the mat, normally I'd say you'd be talking madness, because Sam Alvey's got elite, godlike takedown defense, which I do believe is true. But the takedown defense that Alvey does really well against are the traditional style takedowns, like the single legs and the double legs. And that's not Turman's game. Turman is a master inside the clinch. Even when his back's against the cage, he'll find himself to a dominant position. He can sneak around the back, get one of the hooks in, try and drag his opponent down that way. So that's going to be really interesting to see if he can get Alvey down in that fashion. But Turman won't be shooting for the single legs or double legs, or at least he shouldn't do from what I've seen on tape. So I think Alvey could even be taken down in this fight as well. I think Wellington Turman, as long as he's not stupid and gets into boxing range and starts having a firefight with Alvey in that boxing range, if he does that, I actually think Alvey's going to knock him out, by the way. But that's at one range, and in my opinion, it's going to take errors and mistakes to lead to that as well. So for those reasons, I'm going to be picking Wellington Turman to win this fight. And in the next fight in the light heavyweight division, we've got Dustin Jacoby versus Darren Stewart. Jacoby is currently the minus 170 favourite. They come back on Stewart at plus 150 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the betting line is where it should be. Even if Jacoby was a minus 190, minus 200 favourite, I wouldn't really turn my nose up at it, but I do think that this is where the betting line should be. If you are going to push me for a value side, I would say the minus 170 of Jacoby is the slightly better bet than the plus 150 of Darren Stewart. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, this line hasn't really moved too much, and I don't think it's going to ping off in any one direction. I don't think Jacoby is actually going to be a popular bet at minus 170, but on the flip side, betting Darren Stewart in this spot, which I'll talk about shortly, at plus 150, I don't think is going to be massively favourable to people. So I don't think there's going to be too much action on this fight, which shouldn't swing the betting lines either way. And I do think when they both step into the cage on Saturday night, the betting lines are going to be sitting roughly where they're at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's really interesting seeing Darren Stewart up at light heavyweight in the UFC, because his move up to light heavyweight just opens up a lot of fights that we never thought we'd expect, and this is one of them. I never thought that we'd see Darren Stewart versus Dustin Jacoby, especially when Jacoby's fought the likes of Maxime Grishin and Iwan Kutalaba. You know, these are all fights that Darren Stewart could eventually get as well. But I think in this fight, Darren Stewart's going to be undersized, and I think the fight is going to play out on the feet, and I think that's where Jacoby's a much better fighter. Darren Stewart, I think, will try and wrestle, but we've seen Jacoby be wrestled heavily. He can be taken down, he can be controlled by a good wrestler, but he can also not only get back up to his feet, but fight to get back up to his feet and keep his cardio intact as well. We saw against Kutalaba tried to heavily wrestle Jacoby in round one and did take round one from him, but then Jacoby grew into the fight and took over the fight. I think Iwan Kutalaba's a better wrestler than Darren Stewart. I'm not saying that Stewart can't take Jacoby down, but I don't think that it's going to be a significant aspect of this fight. I think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. And again, Stewart is very capable on the feet. He's got power, he's got good movement, but Jacoby is just that pure kickboxer. He's got solid fundamentals. He'll kick to the legs, he'll kick to the body, he's got a good jab, he's got a good 1-2, he'll put combinations together. And one thing that I've said throughout pretty much every fight that Darren Stewart has had in the UFC that I've analysed is that Darren Stewart fights always end up in the clinch, and there's a lot of clinch work in his fights. Well, it doesn't matter what style of fighter he's facing, there's always clinch work, and it's not always Darren Stewart that engages in it. But inside the clinch, again, I think Jacoby's got the size on him, the strength, the physical advantages. I think he's got the better strikes inside the clinch as well. I don't think Darren Stewart is too solid inside the clinch. and especially against someone like Jacoby. I think Jacoby's going to have advantages at every range on the feet. I think he's going to be better in the clinch. I think he's going to be better in boxing range. And I think he's going to be better out at kicking range as well. And then when you consider that this fight is likely going to be won and lost on the feet, it's hard not to favour Jacoby. I'm picking Dustin Jacoby to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got JJ Aldrich versus Vanessa Demopoulos. Aldrich is currently the -350 favourite. The comeback on Demopoulos at +290 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, it's definitely not with JJ Aldrich at -350. I think that this is one of those fights that's likely going to play out really close that the bookies have got completely wrong. So I think the +290 of Demopoulos is the value side. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, it all depends on if people put Aldrich in the parlays, because I don't think there's going to be many people playing Aldrich straight at -350. I think that'd be crazy. But I do think that there's some people that like playing the fun parlays that will add Aldrich into it. And like I always say, parlays do widen the betting line, but I can't see it going massively pinging off to one side. Aldrich is -400 at another book. I think that's probably about the limit. I don't think she'll close any wider than that, but it also wouldn't shock me if it came back the other way and Aldrich was closer to -300 come fight night on Saturday night either. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I have said that Aldrich shouldn't be a -350 favourite, this wide of a favourite, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that she's going to win this fight. I think Aldrich has definitely got stylistic advantages. I think she's good on the feet. She's the better fighter on the feet here. I think she's going to have more volume. I think her technical striking is more sound. Fundamentals are there. Nice jabs. She doesn't overexert herself. She doesn't overextend on her punches and put too much power into it and gas herself out. But where this fight's going to be close is Demopoulos, I think, is going to get soundly outstruck in this fight, but she's going to realise that from an early stage in this fight. Now, Demopoulos' style is to close the distance if she's not having success on the feet, get the fight down to the mat and try and grapple. And this is where Aldrich can be got at. She can be taken down. She can also score takedowns herself, and that's going to be interesting if she tries pushing a wrestling on top of a striking advantage she's going to have in this fight. So, again, that's one of the reasons why Aldrich should be favoured, because she is more well-rounded, and I think she is better in more areas than Demopoulos. But Demopoulos can make this fight ugly. She can get this fight down to the mat. Once she's on top, you can't rule out a submission in this sort of fight. Demopoulos could easily get into a good position, really start working on Aldrich and find a finish on the mat. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's possible. And it's just little things like that that should make the betting line much closer. But from a prediction perspective, taking all the betting lines out of it, I do think JJ Aldrich is the better striker. I do think she's going to land more volume. I do think that she's going to be definitely more effective in the striking on the night. And I do think that even though Demopoulos will likely look for takedowns, Aldrich could just stop Demopoulos being offensive with her wrestling by fighting fire with fire, if you like, and then JJ Aldrich trying to take Demopoulos down. Demopoulos can be taken down herself. She can also be controlled. So Aldrich is the better fighter. She's the more well-rounded fighter. She should be favoured, just not this much, just not this wide on the betting line. Regardless, I'm picking JJ Aldrich to win this fight. And in the next fight, outside of the main event, this is actually my favourite fight on the entire card. We've got Pat Sabatini versus Jamal Emmers. Emmers is currently the -152 favourite. The comeback on Sabatini at +132 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think the betting line is where it should be. I do think Jamal Emmers should be around this -150 range, with Sabatini around the +130 range. So I don't think there's a lot of value. If you are going to push me for a specific side here, I would side towards Jamal Emmers, even at -150, opposed to the +130 dog shot on Pat Sabatini. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, all the action's been on Emmers. There's a lot of people on Emmers. The lines moved drastically. Emmers just a couple of weeks ago was a -110 pick'em. This fight was a -110 pick'em. So all that money has come in on Emmers. I do agree with that trend, and it's no surprise that it's settled where it is right about now. I just think the value's been diminished a little bit from those early betting lines, and I think that the betting line now is really settled. So come Saturday night, when both fighters have stepped inside the cage, I don't expect the betting lines to be shooting either way. I don't think there's going to be a lot of money coming in on Sabatini, and if there is, it'll be counteracted with money coming in on Emmers and vice versa. I think the betting lines are going to close roughly where they're at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, we've got two wrestlers here, which is very interesting. But what makes it even more interesting is that Sabatini's wrestling is backed up with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, whereas Emma's wrestling is backed up with striking, boxing, Muay Thai. So it's going to be really interesting to see where this fight plays out. I think that because all fights obviously start standing, Emma's is favoured for a reason in this fight, because if the wrestling cancels itself out in this fight, you've then got the striker versus the grappler, and Emma's is the better striker, obviously being the striker. However, if Sabatini becomes relentless with his wrestling and manages to get this fight to the mat, then his jiu-jitsu is definitely better than the grappling of Emma's. Same with Emma's. If Emma's takes Sabatini down, Sabatini is then going to start using his jiu-jitsu to try and reverse positions. We've seen Emma's be reversed on the mat against Chikadze. Emma's took Chikadze down and Chikadze swept him and got on top. So if Chikadze's doing that, Sabatini, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt with plenty of submissions on his record, a dominant grappler, is going to be able to sweep and get on top of Emma's. So for me, it's going to be actually two wrestlers, but with Emma's being the striker, I don't think he's going to engage too much in the wrestling, at least not early on. Sabatini can tire the longer the fight goes on if he's made to wrestle too much. So maybe later in the fight, Emma's looks for takedowns, but especially early on, it's going to be Sabatini, in my opinion, that looks to try and get the fight down to the mat. But this is where stylistically it becomes a bit of a problem for Sabatini, because Emma's in his last fight, he showed that if you do come forward and you do get into his range, especially if you're a smaller fighter, which Sabatini is, Emma's does decent work inside the clinch. He'll wrap up a plum clinch and he'll look to knee to the body, and then he'll exit and angle out of that danger, get back out at range and start striking again. So stylistically, I think Sabatini is going to have some issues in this fight. I just think that Emma's is going to prevent any takedowns in this fight, and if he is taken down, he might be able to pop right back up just before it starts getting too dicey for himself. And then on the feet, although Sabatini can crack, I think Emma's is the quicker striker with the better movement, with the more crisp striking as well. But like I say, the tricky thing about this fight is the fact that if Sabatini, or if the fight does hit the mat, then Sabatini's got a massive advantage down there, and I do think he's going to be so much better in the grappling department than Emma's. But that's just a big if. If the fight doesn't hit the mat, then Emma's is going to likely just piece Sabatini up for 3 rounds and take a very comfortable decision if he doesn't knock him out along the way. I actually think ultimately the wrestling is going to counter itself. I do think Sabatini might score a couple of early takedowns, but I'm not convinced he's going to be able to settle Emma's on his back. I think that the majority of this fight does play out on the feet. That means the fight is likely going to be won and lost on the feet, and that's where Emma's is better. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jamal Emma's to win this fight. And in the final breakdown, we've got Mana Martinez versus Guido Canetti. Martinez is currently the -300 favourite. The comeback on Canetti at +250 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I understand the betting line. I understand that Mana Martinez is a -300 favourite. If you do think the line's too wide, there's other options to look at with props and totals with this fight, but I do get that Mana Martinez on the money line is sitting at -300. I think that although the line is fair and where it's probably expected, if you are going to push me for a value side, I would still say I'd rather put my money on -300 with Mana Martinez than the +250 of Guido Canetti, just because, spoiler alert, I think Martinez is simply going to win the fight. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, it's probably going to fluctuate because Mana Martinez isn't a veteran or a super experienced fighter, whereas Guido Canetti has been in the UFC for a long time, so I could see money coming in on Guido Canetti. I'd get it to an extent, but I don't think the line's going to ping off in any particular direction. I do think it is going to shorten up a little bit though come fight night on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, Mana Martinez is just a strange fighter to watch, and when I say strange, I mean it's because of his power that he has. He seems to have this death touch, which at bantamweight you don't see too often, but he's knocked so many opponents out with just one punch, or at least hurting him with one punch before finishing them off. And it's strange because when you watch these punches, it doesn't look like they've got much behind them. There's no wind up on them, but it just seems that every time he touches his opponent's chin, they either get hurt, rocked, or just stone cold knocked out. And I think for Guido Canetti, that's going to be a terrible thing, because not only do I believe that Canetti does have some durability issues, he can get hit, he can get hurt, he can get rocked and knocked out himself, but he also starts really fast, which is great in that first round, but the second he starts tiring, his striking defense drops a little bit, and again, that's where you can just push forward and get at him. So maybe Martinez has got a bit of a storm to weather here. Maybe he engages in that storm and tries to catch Canetti when he's becoming aggressive and coming forwards. Obviously that distance is going to be closed for Martinez. Canetti does have advantages in this fight though. Canetti's got okay wrestling, he's got decent grappling, so I do think the wrestling and grappling could definitely cause problems for Martinez. Martinez did get submitted by Draco Rodriguez, which, looking at what Draco Rodriguez has done in the UFC since that fight, it probably isn't the best look for Martinez. But if Martinez, he is a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu himself, so he's not a fish out of water down there. But I do think that Canetti is going to have the wrestling and grappling advantages. It's just for Canetti, he's got to close the distance to get that wrestling and grappling game going. And when he closes the distance, I just don't see a scenario where Mana Martinez just doesn't touch him with that deft touch punch from either hand and knock him out, or at least rock him and start the beginning of the end. I think it's going to be difficult for Canetti to get through this fight without getting punched, which is essentially what I think he's going to need to do. And it's for those reasons I'm picking Mana Martinez to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Money Line. I hope you all enjoyed it, and as always, fight fans, I'd appreciate all likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMA Play 365 YouTube channel too. If I've ever helped you win a bet and win some money with my analysis and predictions, then please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Remember, you can get all your betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAplay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot, fun parlays, or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which comes with a money back guarantee by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, which also includes our DFS packages for DraftKings and FanDuel as well. All our subscriptions are at very affordable prices too. Just hop on to MMAplay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.